What I wanted to do today is to give you sort of an overview of some of the key historical events that may have shaped the immigration of the Chinese in particular and other Asian populations in the United States. And I will segue into some of the factors that contributed to the eventual exclusion of the Chinese in 1882. From the year of independence in 1776, the US sort of colonies and US society in general have gone through some major changes. We as a nation expanded our territories greatly from the original 13 colonies to 50 continental United States. During the time period in which the US was able to take over 50 states, there were a lot of things that happened. There were a lot of economic, political, and ideological forces that helped to sustain the kind of expansionist enterprise that many of the framers of the Constitution had envisioned. And so I'm going to touch upon just some of those key events in order to provide you with a broad framework for understanding the context for Asian American history. Some of the challenges and opportunities for the Chinese Americans who came to California and worked in a number of different sort of fields. So some of the dates that I would like to share with you today, you should probably write this down. So we begin with 1776. And then 1789 is when we would ratify the Constitution of the United States, right? So we are not quite a republic yet until we have the ratification of the Constitution, which provides all sorts of rights and privileges of individuals and the states and the federal government. It provides the legal sort of framework, constitutional framework for how people and the government ought to develop relationships between the two. 1842 is a significant year for the Chinese immigration because of the end of the Opium War. The first Opium War, which provided the push context. 1848 is another very significant year because of the end of the Mexican-American War that allowed the United States to basically take over much of the Southwest and the Western territories, including California. And it is in this context the gold was discovered. In 1849, Chinese, along with tens of thousands of others within the United States and also from outside of the United States, would go to California as individual gold prospectors. 1852 is another significant year for the Chinese because that's the year in which in the state of California, they would pass what is known as the foreign miners license tax, where people who were ineligible to become naturalized citizens of the United States were taxed additionally for mining in the gold sort of mining districts. 1854 is the year in which there was a case of murder in one of those mining districts. And this case would go all the way up to the California Supreme Court in 1854, known as People versus Hall case. Hall was a tax collector who went to these mining districts to collect taxes from the Chinese miners. And in the process, Hall killed one of the miners. His name is Lin Sing. And there were several witnesses that testified in the court of law. In the California Supreme Court, however, in the People versus Hall case, California Supreme Court ruled that those testimonies by the Chinese were inadmissible because during that time period, there were several sort of categories of races who were denied the right to testify in the court of law, including African Americans, Native Americans, mulattoes. And the question arose as to whether or not the Chinese could be equally sort of prohibited from testifying against white assailants. And the California Supreme Court sustained that decision, basically saying that, yeah, the Chinese living in the state of California could not testify just like other racial minorities of that state. And of course, we know that 3 years later in 1857, the same question arises in the US Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, where the US Supreme Court denies to African Americans and their descendants the right to become citizens and also the right to testify in the court of law. So they are unable to testify against white persons. They are denied American citizenship, which would lead to the Civil War. Right? So the Dred Scott decision of 1857 would accelerate the conflict over slavery during that time period. And in 1860, we are in full-blown war between the North and the South. Between 1861 and 1869, during the height of the Civil War, the tens of thousands of Chinese Americans were employed to work on and to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. So this is, it would take 9 years to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. Thousands of immigrants were employed on the eastern part, and on the west coast, over the Sierra Nevadas, the Chinese, 12 to 14,000 Chinese Americans were employed to complete. Now, 1870s is a very interesting year because it's shortly after the Civil War, we had passed a number of important federal constitutional amendments, including the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment was the amendment that would end slavery. The 14th Amendment is the one that would provide for equal protection and the citizenship clause. And the 15th Amendment is the voting right. So these were really significant sort of guarantees designed to extend the rights of citizenship and all of the other privileges that come with being an American citizen to recently freed African Americans. But that privilege had extended to other minorities as well. So when you actually do something for one set of minority, it has a significant implication for other minorities as well. And clearly, with the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the Chinese in America would significantly benefit from passage of these two particular amendments that was originally designed to sort of help the recently freed African Americans. So during the 1870s, there were a lot of things that happened, and it is this period that I'm going to focus on for today. It was time of a lot of sort of changes. There were some things that still provided the Chinese Americans with significant challenges of being incorporated into American society. But then there were others, things that happened that would provide the Chinese with a sense of hope that things would work out much better than in the previous sort of decades, right? So it was time of really flux. Anything could have happened. It was time period that Professor Takaki would refer to as a time period of liminality. Things could have sort of turned out very differently had we made different kinds of decisions during that time period. But we're going to focus on 1870s today. And then 1882, we know that the Chinese immigrants were the first sort of nationality group that was singled out for exclusion by nationality, right? So we don't have any other immigration exclusion law that prohibits immigration of a particular nationality groups. It's only the Chinese Exclusion Act that's still in our immigration statutes, right? We don't have, for instance, Italian exclusion law. We don't have Irish exclusion law. We don't even have Japanese exclusion law. Of course, we have a different named law that targeted Japanese Americans, the Gentleman's Agreement, but it was not a congressional act, as was the case with the Chinese exclusion law. So 1882, again, becomes a turning point in Chinese American history in particular, but more broadly in Asian American history, because what happens to the Chinese will also have an impact on other Asian populations coming into the United States after the 1882 exclusion law. 1892 is another very significant law that, through the passage of another congressional act known as the Geary Act of 1892, it would extend the Chinese exclusion indefinitely until 1943 through a passage of what is known as the Magnuson Act. We would basically undo the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. 1896 is the Plessy versus Ferguson case. It's the federal U.S. Supreme Court case that would establish what is known as the separate but equal doctrine, allowing for the separate accommodations based on race. So this is the year in which we would have, by law, racial segregation of accommodations, including schools, public facilities, transportations, etc. Right? And that law is repealed in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education case. Right? And 1898, finally, a lot of things would happen in 1898. The Spanish-American War, which would have a huge impact on the Filipino immigration to the United States. We would acquire not only the Philippines, but parts of Cuba, Guam, other sort of Spanish sort of territories. 1 year later, in 1899, we would take over Hawaii. In 1900, we would pass what is known as the Organic Act that would formalize the takeover of Hawaii. In 1898, there was another U.S. Supreme Court case known as the Wong Kim Ark versus the United States. And this case deals with the second generation Chinese American as to whether or not the Chinese Americans who were born on American soil under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution were eligible to become American citizens. And we have, so that's, I wanted to kind of lay that out to you in terms of some of the major sort of events that happened since the independence, since 1776, up to the end of the 19th century, that profoundly sort of shaped the contours of Chinese immigration in particular, but its broader sort of implications for other Asian immigrant populations as well, and also the second generation. The reason why I want to give you kind of broad lensed sort of view of history is so that you can understand the flow of history. History is not just simply about dates and events, but it helps to understand what happens in a particular phase, a period in American history, when you're able to make connections with other things that happen prior to and afterwards. Right? So that you're able to kind of see the flow of that history. Things don't happen in vacuum, but there are things that lead to a major event, which would have other kind of, ripple effects as well. So you have to be able to see these events continuously and not in isolation. And so that's the part of the reason why I wanted to give you a sense of, what was happening during this time period in terms of the ebb and flow of history. And there's a tendency among some scholars to just emphasize, negative aspects of history, which I think is unfortunate, but that's not telling the whole truth. There were a lot of things that happened that were really positive and that demonstrate the resilience of the populations that were discriminated against. The story is not just simply one of discrimination against minority population, but stories should also simultaneously talk about how they were resilient, how they contributed to making things better. And so it is that combination of and the complexity of things that would unfold. That's the task that we have. We are trying to sort of understand that complexity of American history. The first thing that I would like to share with you is a treaty that was consummated between United States and China, known as the Burlingame Treaty. And I think the video talked about this, and it's important to highlight that in 1868, there were a lot of things that were happening within the United States. Right? We talked about how in 1868, we had successfully amended the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Right? The 14th Amendment to the Constitution basically allowed two major things. One is the what is known as the Equal Protection Clause. What that basically means is that regardless of your political status, you are treated equally under the law. Everyone is and should be treated without discrimination, without regard to their social status, without how much power they may have. The law is equally applied to all citizens and non-citizens. So that's the first thing, the Equal Protection Clause. And the second was the Citizenship Clause, right? The Citizenship Clause stipulated that if you're born on US jurisdiction and territory, then you are automatically by birth an American citizen, regardless of the political status of your parents. US territory is quite expansive. It not only includes the 50 continental United States, but also all of the areas that are outside of the United States, but still come under the jurisdiction of the US government. And some of these territories then include US military installations. The famous ones is Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, right? An area that the US had occupied since the Spanish-American War in 1898. US has had presence in Cuba and many other countries all over the world. So all of the US military bases come under the US jurisdiction. So if you're born on these military bases, then you are automatically an American citizen. The 14th Amendment, then, the Citizenship Clause, greatly expanded the ability of people to become US citizens. It's one of the most sort of liberal citizenship policies in the world. So it raised a tremendous amount of optimism for the Chinese living in the state of California. Even the Chinese who could not testify against white persons in the court of law in the 1850s. By the 1860s, there was a great sort of expansion of some basic rights, particularly for those who were born on American soil. Even if you were not born on American soil, you were still protected under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, right? Just because you are immigrant does not mean that the US government, whether it's local or state or federal government, could discriminate against you. Citizens and non-citizens came under the same law, right? They were to be treated equally under the law, right? So this was a tremendous era for not just the Chinese in America, but for American society. In fact, we were making a huge sort of change for the better, right? We are expanding opportunities. We're expanding this notion of equality to the great sort of number of people who had been previously discriminated against legally, right, by the governments. So what exactly then was this treaty? The treaty is named after a person by the name of Anson Burlingame, who was sort of like an ambassador to the Manchu court in Peking. In Peking is Beijing. Peking is a Cantonese pronunciation of Beijing, right, which is the capital city of China. So he headed this goodwill mission to China in order to accomplish several things. Basically, what the United States wanted from China was a friendly relationship where they could continue to engage in international trade with China. So for many, many decades prior, Americans were interested in maintaining good sort of trade relationship with China, precisely because we had a lot of things that the Chinese were offering at that time. The United States had signed a treaty modeled after British upon the conclusion of the First Opium War and also the Second Opium War, which were quite disadvantageous to the Chinese. One of the goals of the US sending Burlingame to China was to make things a little bit better by revising the 1858 Treaty of Tianjin, which was sort of like the Treaty of Nanking that was signed with China upon the conclusion of the First Opium War. And it stipulated number of provisions that or really sort of in retrospect, incredible. So, one of the first provisions was that the United States and the people of the United States in China shall respect the territorial integrity of China, and the Chinese emperor shall have eminent domain over territories occupied by the US and China. And secondly, says with respect to trade or navigation within the Chinese dominion, the Chinese government shall make the final decision. So I want you to sort of take a look, read again these two provisions, and maybe we could have a informal discussion about why this might be important in the context of what was happening during this time period in China and how this might have impacted Chinese immigration to the United States. So I want you to take a read it once again, and then let's talk about why this was significant.
I think the second one about like concerning trade, China shall make the final decisions. I
Mhm.
think that one was especially significant because that meant that the U.S. would be respecting their opinions on whether or not we can bring in like illegal drugs and stuff like that,
Mhm.
which is what caused the first two opium wars. And then that would also, I guess, stop one of the push reasons for Chinese immigration.
Do you remember the conversation that we had about extraterritoriality, the Kohong system? Basically, the British wanted to weaken the ability of the Chinese government to investigate and also to deny importation of opium into the country. And so this treaty attempted to restore territorial integrity and the Chinese emperor's dominion over its own territory back to China. They're trying to restore the sovereignty of the Chinese government in being able to monitor what comes in, what goes out, and also have some authority, legal authority over people within their territory. If they don't have such a territory, then they don't have a sovereignty. If you don't have the right and ability to govern the people that occupy your territory, then by definition, you're not a sovereign nation. And so, what this treaty attempted once again to do is to restore sovereignty to the Chinese government, which is a very respectful thing to do, wouldn't you say? So, they are trying to be very nice to the Chinese government, essentially. There were other sort of key provisions of the treaty, right? And it stated that the two governments shall recognize the inherent and inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance, and also the mutual advantage of the free migration and emigration of their citizens and subjects, respectively, for purposes of curiosity, of trade, or as permanent residents. I find this provision to be truly incredible. So I want you to take a look at this, read it once again, and see what stands out for you. Two governments shall recognize the inherent and inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance, and also the mutual advantage of the free migration and emigration of their citizens and subjects, respectively, for purposes of curiosity, of trade, or as permanent residents.
I was just going to say that the way that I interpreted it felt like they were recognizing that people can change their beliefs. I'm not
Right? It says here the inherent and inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance. Let's think about that for a second. Inherent and inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance. What does that mean? And why would US government stipulate this? This is not something that the Chinese government came up with, but this was something that the US government stated as a condition of this treaty. What does it mean to have an inherent right?
To me, it sounds a lot like what our founding fathers kind of talked about, but they're just adding on with this treaty about how free will of man to move and change his home. It's kind of respecting the idea that the Chinese can come to the United States and go back home if they choose to do so.
Yeah, the language is very similar, is it not? Right? The idea that the all men are created equal, and this idea is inherent to us, inherent to being a human being. It's not separable. It is something that is so intimately bound up with being a human being that all men are created equal. I mean, if you take that idea very seriously, it's a revolutionary idea, right? The idea that all men are created equal, the idea that all people should be treated equally under the law. How revolutionary is that? I mean, that's an amazing idea. Here, once again, in the Burlingame Treaty, they're stipulating that there is an inherent right in people that cannot be separated. And that right includes the right to change their home. What that means is that they could go anywhere around the world. Then you don't have to be stuck in one place. And if you so chose, you could change your allegiance. You could be Chinese one day and then you say, oh, you know what? I no longer want to give my allegiance, full allegiance to the Chinese emperor. I want to be an American. Have this right to change their home and also the allegiance. And that right, according to the Burlingame Treaty, is inseparable from being a human being. It is inherent. It is an inherent right, which I think is quite amazing, right? They're not just simply saying that, oh, because you're a citizen of the United States, you have a right to vote. They're not saying that. They're saying something that is much more fundamental, that is so sort of tied to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States. I find it really amazing that they would use such a language. This wasn't just the ordinary treaty between the nations. They're recognizing something that was really fundamental and that was really sort of tied to who we were as Americans at that time. This is what being an American means. Having, established that fundamental right, we also recognize that, yeah, it's important for people to be able to migrate and emigrate as citizens and subjects. And it's a free migration and immigration. There's no strings attached. And we recognize the importance of allowing people to go back and forth, right? Because there's a mutual advantage. And then they also go on to say, respectively, for purposes of curiosity, of trade, or as permanent residents. Let's think about that just a second. Respectively, for purposes of curiosity, of trade, or as of also engaging in trade. And also, if you want to become a permanent resident of either country, you could do so. This is 1868, not 2020. This is in the middle of the 19th century. Through the Burlingame Treaty, United States and China wanted to establish a new relationship where they recognize this inherent right of people to move from one place to another. For what purpose? Well, for purposes of fulfilling your curiosity. I mean, that's just amazing language. I'm curious about West Virginia. I'm curious about San Francisco. I would like to go there and visit. Under the terms of the treaty, they were permitted to come because it will satisfy their curiosity. And I also wanted to find a way to make ends meet. I want to engage in some sort of trade. Maybe I could bring some tea leaves to Boston and sell to its residents to engage in this kind of commercial activity. And under the terms of this treaty, yeah, the Chinese were permitted to do so. And the Americans simultaneously could do the same. Maybe I would like to introduce Levi's jeans to the Chinese. I'll bring a batch of jeans, something that they have never experienced. And they could also engage in other kinds of fur trade was a major one by some of the famous American merchants. And also ginseng, you thought that ginseng was product of China. Well, in fact, ginseng was product of places like Wisconsin and Minnesota, Kentucky. A lot of Native Americans in those regions actually utilized ginseng for decades, for ages. And we had exported, not imported ginseng from China, but we had exported ginseng from those regions to China as well. So we had these merchants who were engaged in various kinds of commercial relationship with China throughout the centuries, throughout 18th and 19th, 20th, and even in present century as well, right? So they had a lot to gain by having that kind of commercial relationship with China. And under the terms of the treaty, both the Chinese and the Americans could come and go as freely as they wanted, and they could settle there. and they could become permanent residents. They could even change their allegiance if they wanted to, because that was part of being a human being. Find this treaty to be amazing? I find it to be just incredibly amazing. This was like the free trade and free immigration, free open border policy in 1868. They were way ahead of their time. Could you imagine if people could come and go as they please, no passport required, and you could go and live in any place you want, you could engage in any kind of trade activities or to satisfy your curiosity, and you could become permanent resident. That's a definition of free person, is it not? Yeah, and that's what they were trying to sort of, I think, foster through the terms of this treaty in 1868, right? So this was a amazing, I think, sort of idea behind the treaty. Let me go on to the final sort of provision of the treaty. And it also sought to provide some semblance of protection for both Americans and the Chinese, right? The Chinese subjects visiting or residing in the United States shall enjoy the same privileges, immunities, and exemptions in respect to travel or residence as may there be enjoyed by the citizens or subjects of the most favored nation. Okay, read it one more time and let it sink in a little bit and see what it really means here, right? The Chinese subjects visiting or residing in the United States shall enjoy the same privileges, immunities, and exemptions in respect to travel or residence as may there be enjoyed by the citizens or subjects of the most favored nation.
I think that if we take this like quite literally, education, employment, housing, or like land ownership would be under those. But obviously, we've seen that this treaty wasn't taken literally, because those same privileges, because of citizenship, were not granted to Chinese Americans at that time. But I think Maria was very right in saying that at that point, and still today, citizenship, it does take you quite a ways, but at that point it was also tied to the race that you had, or the gender.
Yeah, absolutely. Several layers of complexity here. One is that in principle, there were a lot of things that we could be really proud of, right? The idea that people should be treated equally under the law, that all men are created equal, right? These are principles very lofty and very ideal. But in practice, a lot of these ideals fell short. And some of the intervening factors included race, gender, sexuality, social class, and various other sort of privileges. So, throughout American history, we've been trying to sort of bridge that gap between the ideal and practice. And we haven't perfected it yet. There are still challenges. And clearly in the 19th century, there were challenges, despite the fact that in 1868, we had, passed the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause of the law that says that everyone should be treated equally under the law, but that did not happen. So there was the ideal, but in practice, we had long ways to go. Even in the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, right? It stipulated that all men are created equal, right? But then it was time period when slavery was raging. It was time period when, Native American lands were being grabbed. Time period when all kinds of discriminatory laws had impacted racial minorities and women and other marginalized populations in American society. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that, yeah, in fact, there was, on the one hand, tremendous ideas that provided a sort of framework for what kind of society we should aspire to be. On the other, harsh reality of racism, sexism, of all kinds of other isms that got in the way of fulfilling the American dream and the American ideals. And, what is the sort of the key in bridging the gap between the ideal and reality? How did it happen? It didn't happen automatically. The only way that we were able to bridge the gap throughout history, we've had this, major gap between the ideal and and the reality. And the key point for you to take away is that the ordinary people, when they said, there is a huge gap, there's a discrepancy between the ideal and practice, that we need to bring these ideals in alignment with reality. And so various sort of uh, disadvantaged populations in American society and history, when they made those kinds of, demands, that our society was able to, over time, bridge the gap. The civil rights movement, the abolition sort of movements during slavery, right? Or any kinds of like women's movements, or Chinese Americans who contested the constitutionality of discriminatory practices, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. All of these sort of protest movements were an effort to bridge the gap between the ideal and practice. The Black Lives Matter movement in the year 2020 is an effort to bridge the gap between the ideal that people should be treated equally under the law and the harsh reality of unfair enforcement, particular sort of populations in American society today. There's a gap, and people are saying, let's bridge the gap. And that has happened throughout American history. And the Chinese American experience was no exception. They were not just simply discriminated against, right? But they also said, hey, I believe in the American ideal. I believe in all of these provisions that were stipulated in the Burlingame Treaty. Yeah, it makes sense that people should be treated like free persons. They should have a right to emigrate and immigrate, change their allegiance. They have a right to engage in rightful sort of commercial trade activities, but they do not have, and they should not be treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, because of their nationality. And that's not a novel sort of idea, because that is inscribed in the Constitution of the United States. The Chinese Americans would remind the Americans of those rights when they were discriminated against because of their ethnicity, because of their race, because of their gender, whatever, right? Because when people are discriminated against, we are deviating from those ideals. I find the Burlingame Treaty of 1868 to be consistent with some of the founding principles of American society, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and all of the other sort of efforts to align our principles with reality. So it sounds like, it sounds quite amazing, but actually it's pretty consistent all along with many of things that we've been trying to sort of accomplish in the past, how many years? 230 years or something like that, 250 years. And yeah, along this path, we've had major challenges where the reality deviated so much from those ideals. There were additional sort of protections during this time period. The Civil Rights Act of 1870. It was designed to protect African American voters in the South. It stated that under Section 16 of the Act, no state legislation can apply to a Chinaman which does not apply equally to all people, right? So it specified that Chinese persons should be treated equally under the law. So once again, in the 1870s, it represented a sort of state of liminality where there was a tremendous diversity in the state of California, right, constituted by Italians, Greeks, Irish, Mexicans, Africans, Chinese, and white number of other sort of white populations, original Mexicanos who had lived in the state of California, and the various sort of international populations, right, people from Chile and other parts of South America had gone to California. And all of these sort of populations would come under the protection of the Constitution. Chinese, too, would be protected under the 1868 Burlingame Treaty and the Constitution and other sort of constitutional amendments that were passed during this time period. Despite all of these protections, the reality for the Chinese was very different. And eventually, some of the things that would happen to the Chinese population in California would eventually lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, what are some of the things that would happen in the 1860s and 1870s leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So, on the one hand, you had tremendous optimism, right, that was shared by a number of Chinese populations because they had the constitutional protection, they had the Burlingame Treaty, right? They felt like, oh, they are going to be treated like, members of the most favored nation. But in reality, what happened was that the Chinese populations who were engaged in a number of different sort of occupations. Remember, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, right? So tens of thousands of Chinese who were in the Sierra Nevadas, right, laying down the tracks, had returned to Sacramento, had returned to the city and county of San Francisco. So they had to find alternative ways of eking out their living. So railroad was done. They had to find other ways. One of the most sort of popular ways in which they gained their sort of livelihood was through laundry business. And it is in this area where they would encounter a number of sort of challenges of adapting to life here in the United States. By 1870, there were some 2,600 Chinese laundrymen in California, and 1,300 of them lived in San Francisco. Some 12% of the Chinese population were in San Francisco, right? So they were concentrated in particularly the San Francisco area. And one of the local ordinances that the Chinese laundry persons encountered was a license fee that ranged from $2 for one horse-drawn vehicle and $4 for two horses and $15 for more than two horses, right? Which makes logical sense. So if your business is big and booming, where it requires more horses to sort of carry your laundry, you will be expected to pay higher license fees. But it also stipulated something sort of counterintuitive. It said that the laundries employing no horse-drawn vehicles in their operation should now pay the highest fees of all. So this was an interesting kind of ordinance, right? Ordinance is like a city law. And they were simply trying to sort of target those businesses where they were not utilizing any horses. And there were a lot of Chinese persons who were carrying on their shoulders a pole, and at the end of the poles, they were carrying these sort of handheld basket on which they were carrying fruits and laundry. So they were carrying on these businesses without relying on horses because horses required capital and they didn't have such capital. And the city of San Francisco were trying to sort of target those businesses. This was one of the several what is known as the nuisance ordinances that Governor Bigler, as well as the city supervisors of the city and San Francisco, county of San Francisco, passed during this time period, right? I'm going to end with a couple of other ordinances that they had passed, right? We're almost time, right? Almost out of time here. So that is known as the basket carrying ordinance, right? So you could not carry poles hung across their shoulders. They had what is known as the lodging house ordinance, where it prohibited people living in a sort of house or tenements sort of smaller than 500 cubic feet of airspace per individual. And people who violated these ordinances and went to jail, they had their hair sort of shaven by the law enforcement officers, which would have a deleterious sort of cultural impact on the Chinese populations because it was such an important cultural symbol, important part of their cultural identity. And a lot of the Chinese persons were wearing this long queue, which was sort of synonymous with being a Chinese person during that time period. And they were also prohibited from sending back the human remains to China, which was also a very important part of their cultural ritual to have their sort of fellow countrymen buried in their hometown back in their villages. These were local ordinances that were passed, which made it really difficult for the Chinese Americans to practice their cultural norms here in San Francisco, and how those things will demonstrated sort of effort on the part of some Americans to make the lives of the Chinese really difficult. I want you to sort of walk away from today's conversation this sort of duality, right? So on the one hand, you had these legal protections through the Burlingame Treaty and also the 14th Amendment, the Constitution, gave the Chinese Americans sense of optimism. And on the other hand, there were these local ordinances, right, that challenged these constitutional amendments and the harsh reality of trying to adapt to life in San Francisco for the Chinese. Right. So the question emerges, what happens for the Chinese persons who were caught in between the ideal on the one hand and also the harsh reality on the other.